I'm going to go ahead and I have the slides. I'm going to attempt to load them here in the chat. So if you want to download them or follow along with the file, you're more than welcome to do that. I am going to see if I can do that. I think this is the file. I hope that's the file, Marie, is that correct?
Let me see if I can find chat.
Oh, you can't see it yet. I have to send it. So hopefully that's the right file.
It's the right file name.
Okay, that's good. That's good. All right, we have a couple more people joining us and we'll get started here momentarily. I did put the file in the chat, so if you want to download the slides, you're more than welcome to do that. All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm Lori Greiner. I'm a longtime member of ACE, and I'm a member of the Diversity and Accessibility Learning Community, and I'm going to be your host today. Tunalee Martin, who normally does this, or did the last one anyway, she's on vacation and she asked if I would fill in, and I'm glad that you are able to join us. It might be a light crowd today, being the middle of July, and you know, we kind of dropped the ball on getting it promoted. So we're going to go ahead, and we are recording today's session. So you'll have the recording, and we can share it with the rest of the membership afterwards. But I am glad that you were able to join us in person today. Today we have Marie Lohman. She's a web developer from Oregon State University Extension Service. She supports digital accessibility throughout the organization by providing training and audits the content creators and developing innovative accessibility solutions for all their web platforms. And we are very pleased to have Marie with us today. With that, I am going to turn this over to her. Towards the end of today's session, I will be uploading a link to an evaluation. So if you would just take, a quick 30 seconds to a minute to complete the quick survey, we'd appreciate your feedback. Also, if you want to hold your questions to the end, that would be great, or put them in the chat and I'll be monitoring the chat, and we'll try to get all the questions answered at the end of Marie's presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Marie.
All right. Well, hello. As Lori said, my name is Marie Lohman, and I'm a web developer for the Oregon State University Extension Service. And I am really grateful to have been invited to present as part of this webinar series. And I'm really grateful to everyone who is here live right now. And I'm really grateful to anyone who may be watching a recording of this in the future. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about website accessibility. And this is a really broad topic that can cover everything from like really simple pages that are hand coded in HTML to more complex sites that are managed in a system like Drupal or WordPress, or even like social media or other platforms where you might host content online. So to get started, I want to just take a minute to address what it means actually for a website to be accessible. There are a whole bunch of potential different ways you could define accessibility, and some are more broad, some are more narrow. And, as far as I know, there is no one like official single definition that everyone uses and agrees on. But when you hear people talking about accessibility kind of in day-to-day life or work, they're often referring kind of specifically to the use of websites or other things by people with disabilities. So you could definitely also consider things like language access or translation, localization stuff to be part of accessibility. but for this presentation, this is the definition that I'm going to be using, which is that a website is accessible when all content and functionality is equally available to and effective for all users, regardless of ability or disability. So since we are primarily going to be talking about how people with disabilities use websites, I think it's important to have some background on the types of assistive technology that are used for digital tasks like accessing a website. So when we talk about assistive technology kind of more generally, I think most of us tend to think of like physical objects that people use, like wheelchairs or canes or even like eyeglasses. But when we're talking about digital accessibility, these physical items are only one type of assistive technology that we need to keep in mind. So those kind of, physical devices that you use to interact with a computer are called hardware. Assistive technology can also be software, which is just a program that's installed on the computer itself. Or it can also be like configuration or settings options within a program, like a web browser, like Chrome or Firefox. So now I'll go through some examples of some actual specific types of assistive technology. So the one people are most likely to have heard of before is probably a screen reader. A screen reader is a piece of software, so just a program that can be installed on a computer without any specific equipment needed to use it. And what it does is it converts text that's displayed on the screen to speech or to sound. So that's obviously helpful for people who have trouble seeing or reading text on a screen. So a lot of people who have low vision or who are blind. So this next one, keyboards, I think probably everyone is familiar with. But what some people might not know is that it's possible to use a keyboard to do the things that are usually done with a mouse, like clicking on links or buttons and other things like that. So some people use that functionality as like a shortcut just for convenience, but it can also be considered assistive technology for people who can't use a mouse for whatever reason. So like if people have limited motor control of their hands or can't see the mouse pointer on the screen. So another type of assistive technology that might be used by someone with low vision is a screen magnifier. These are used to enlarge content on screen to make it easier to see. So a lot of us are probably familiar with like the zoom in and zoom out functionality that's built into like web browsers and other programs. But there are also like specific pieces of software that you can install, like what's in the photo on the slide, where it enlarges just one part of the page while leaving the rest of it still visible. So this type of assistive technology that I call style overrides, they're really pretty common, but a lot of people aren't aware of them or tend not to think about them. What they are like configuration or settings or options within a web browser like Firefox or Google Chrome and some other programs. And what they do is they let you essentially override the visual appearance of the page. So sometimes this is like different display modes, like night mode or high contrast mode. But often users are able to make more specific customizations to meet their own individual preferences and needs. So for example, on the slide, I have a screenshot of the website I work on, the OSU Extension website, with style overrides applied that have changed the background color, the text color, and the link color. So you can probably guess people might use this to increase contrast between text and the background if they have like low vision. But other people might actually use this to reduce contrast if like they're prone to migraines or something like that. Another use case is blocking images, particularly moving images or videos, because they can be very, very distracting for people with certain cognitive conditions. So here now we have an example of assistive technology that is an actual specialized physical device that people use. So this is a refreshable braille display, and it works similarly to a screen reader, but instead of converting the text on screen to speech or to sound, it converts it to braille characters, which pop up on the little plastic surface that it has. So you maybe can guess this is helpful to people who both have trouble seeing or reading text on screen and who have trouble hearing or understanding spoken speech. So then this last example I have actually covers a pretty broad category of devices as well as software that people can use to interact with computers when they can't use either a mouse or a keyboard. So some of these are more kind of uncommon, like there's software that can track your eye movements to let you interact with elements on the screen, or there's like stick devices that people can manipulate with their mouths or their feet instead of their hands. But there are other kinds that are like really, really common, like voice assistants, which I will not name specifically so that they don't start going off in people's rooms. But when you're using one of those voice assistants, you're interacting with a computer without using a mouse or a keyboard and are instead using your voice as an alternate input method. So as you can see, there are a whole bunch of different types of assistive technology. And in order for a website to be accessible, it needs to be compatible with all of them. And so the prospect or the idea of having to figure out how to make a website compatible with all of those different technologies is like super overwhelming. But luckily, there are sets of guidelines that have been created to guide you in that, so you're not totally on your own. And that brings us to the next topic I want to talk about, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also called WCAG. So WCAG is a set of digital accessibility guidelines that was developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C for short. This is the same organization that kind of, W3C is also the organization that defines the standard for HTML, which is like the coding language that web pages are built with. So their set of guidelines has really become like the industry standard for accessibility. And at this point, it's gone through a couple of versions. It's currently on version 2.1, but version 2.2 is set to come out like literally any day now. Like I don't really know the process for how these things get released, but I keep hearing that it's coming very, very soon. So also within WCAG, there are 3 levels of compliance, starting with A, or single A. And this is like kind of the bare minimum standard. Like if you're not meeting single A level, then there are probably a pretty significant number of people who just straight up can't use the site at all. The next level is AA, and that's sort of the medium and kind of the standard level, where like everything's working okay, reasonably well, and things are accessible to an acceptable level. And then AAA is like the ideal that we all strive towards, where like everything is 100% fully accessible. So just to be clear, WCAG itself is not like a law or anything. And also to be clear, if it isn't obvious, I am not a lawyer, so don't take anything that I'm about to say on this slide as legal advice. But I just wanted to touch on how WCAG is like used within the US legal system. So first, there are some specific laws that do like explicitly have it written into their language that they require compliance with WCAG, usually at the AA level. The one that's probably the most relevant to people here is Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, but there are others. And then when it comes to the ADA, it's a little bit different. If I understand it correctly, then technically WCAG is not explicitly required by the ADA. But what has happened is that when an organization has been found to be in violation of the ADA because they have an inaccessible website, then the courts have ordered that in order to correct that and make their website accessible, they need to bring it up to WCAG AA level. So that sort of implies that WCAG AA is at least acceptable within the ADA. So the reason I haven't linked to WCAG at this point is because if you look it up now, you'd probably be quite overwhelmed because it's really, really long. And it's also kind of targeted at like developers or people who build websites more than people who create content that lives on websites. So it can be pretty highly technical. And so for that reason, I decided I'd pull out some of the requirements that I think are most important for content creators. So first of all is this concept of true text. So when we were talking about assistive technology earlier, we touched on a couple types that convert text on the screen to either sound or Braille characters. And what's important to understand about those, and this also applies to like most other kinds of technology, so like search engines and stuff, they can only read what is called true text. And what it means to be true text is that it is not an image of text. So you might get images of text when you like take a photo or make a scan of a paper document, or when you take a screenshot of a web page, or like, obviously, if you're like designing a logo or some other kind of word art in Photoshop or something. And often it's like obvious when text is actually an image, but if you can't tell and want to check, one thing you can try is to try highlighting the text with a mouse. And if you can highlight it like character by character, like hopefully you can see me doing now, that means that it's true text and can be read by assistive technology. On the other hand, if when you try to highlight it, that doesn't happen and it doesn't work, that probably means it's an image and won't be read by assistive technology. And that kind of leads us into this idea of alt text for images, because if assistive technology can only read true text, then that raises the question of like, well, what happens with images then? So like a screen reader, for example, can tell the user that there is an image on the page, but it can't like understand or interpret that image in any way. So that's why there's this requirement. For all images, there must be text that serves the equivalent purpose, either elsewhere on the page or encoded with the image as alt text. And to me, it seems like most people who are even like slightly aware of web accessibility tend to like know that there's this concept of alt text that exists, but it also seems like a lot of people are really unclear on how they actually should write alt text well. So the key thing to understand is that the purpose of alt text is to serve the equivalent purpose of an image, not to describe an image. And so what I learned is that the best way to write alt text is by asking yourself this question: if I couldn't have an image here, what text would I replace it with? So for example, say I created a document and put the Oregon State University logo at the top. I asked myself, okay, so if I couldn't use images in this document, what would I put instead of the logo? And I think in most cases, I just put like the name of the university, like Oregon State University. And so that's what the alt text for the logo should be. If I were to put something like Oregon State University logo or logo of OSU, that would be describing what the image is, but it isn't the text I would actually put in place of that image. So a little more complicated example might be, say you're creating a page to advertise like a summer camp, and it has like photos of kids doing various activities. Excuse me. Kids doing like various activities like kayaking or rope climbing or whatever kids do at camp. In that situation, I think a lot of people are tempted to put in alt text that describes the contents of each photo, like maybe a child paddling a kayak on a blue lake or something like that. But when you think about this question, if you couldn't have photos on the page, what would you replace them with? I don't think you would ever actually replace those photos with that text. Instead, if you think about like the reason why those photos are on the page, I just made up this scenario, but I think that the reason would be that they are conveying the activities that kids do at this camp. So if you couldn't use those photos, you would replace them with text that describes the activities that kids do at the camp. So maybe for like a kayaking photo on that page, better alt text would be like, kayaking is one of the activities kids do at this camp. But one thing to keep in mind is that, again, I just made up this scenario, but I think if that were real, it would be likely that somewhere on that page, you probably already have text that's describing the camp activities, like just a paragraph in the middle of the body. And if that's the case, you ask yourself, what would I replace these images with? You probably wouldn't replace them with a second text description of the activities, because that information is already on the page, so that would be redundant. So when images are redundant, or if they're purely decorative, it is okay to answer the question, what would I replace them with just nothing, and then just have the alt text be blank. Somewhat related to that is the requirement that video and audio content on websites must have transcripts or captions. So this is another one that I think probably most people are at least aware of already, but I wanted to emphasize that like even now, even today with like AI and language processing technology getting better and more powerful all the time, it's still really important to have a human being double check any captions or transcripts that are automatically generated. And this isn't a matter of like just incorrect captions being annoying or unprofessional, which I think is true, but it can also happen that when speech is transcribed incorrectly, it can like change the information that is conveyed. So like imagine if someone in a video says, this is really dangerous. That might get changed by a transcription program to say, this isn't really dangerous. And then you have captions that say the exact opposite thing that the original audio does, which is clearly an issue. So there are a couple more things to keep in mind related to multimedia or content that contains motion or sound, which also includes things like animated GIFs or scrolling parallax images. So first, motion and sound must not autoplay when a page loads. Second, users must be able to pause or stop motion and sound at any time. And third, visuals must not flash more than 3 times per second. And these requirements aren't necessarily related to assistive technology or compatibility with it, but they're meant to ensure a good and a safe experience for people with certain cognitive or neurological conditions like epilepsy. So the next concept to be aware of is the reading order of a page. This refers maybe obviously to the order in which content on a page is read by assistive technology. And this is mostly an issue when you have a page or a site with a layout that has multiple columns side by side. When you can visually look at and see a page, you can usually use visual cues to kind of determine what on the page is more or less important and what order things should be read in. But when you're using assistive technology, it just reads text in the order that it's included in the page's source code or in the HTML for the page. So when you're designing a page, you need to make sure that it makes sense both when it's viewed, full screen with all of the columns next to each other, and also when it's read in the source code order. And later in this presentation, I'll talk about a tool that can help you do that. So here's another one that I think a lot of people might already be at least aware of. But in WCAG, there are requirements for having sufficient color contrast between text and the background that it's on. There's this really great tool available online that you can use called the WebAIM Color Contrast Checker. And you can Google that to find it pretty easily, or maybe somebody can find it and put it in chat. But it lets you put 2 hex codes for 2 colors, and it will tell you whether the contrast between them meets WCAG standards, and if so, at what level. So like AA or AAA. So I use this all the time and highly recommend it. Yeah, so when earlier we were talking about assistive technology, another one I talked about was style overrides, which people can use to basically override the appearance of a page. And what this requirement here means basically is that websites need to allow for that or need to be compatible with that. And to an extent, that's kind of controlled by how the website is like coded in the back end. So if you aren't a developer, you might not have like total control over this, but there are definitely a couple of things that you can do to help. So one is, again, avoiding images of text, because like with screen readers, this assistive technology only works with true text. The other thing I would recommend is to really avoid using PDFs for content that is hosted online to the absolute furthest extent possible. And the reason for that is that the PDF format was created with the intention of carrying a lot of really detailed and specific visual design or style information, and that tends to interfere with the functioning of these style overrides. So next is a really, really important requirement, and that's that headings on a web page need to be properly tagged. And the term tagged comes from the concept of HTML tags. And like I mentioned earlier, HTML is like the coding language that web pages are built with. In HTML, there are a few tags like specifically for headings. So if you know HTML, you might know H1, H2, H3, and so on. But I think most people who are watching this or who will be watching the recording are probably not actually writing HTML themselves, but I'm guessing are using some kind of visual editor with like various formatting controls. So in that case, what it means to tag text is essentially to apply a format or a style to it. So every platform that I'm familiar with that has any kind of visual text editor has some kind of specific control for headings. And so you need to figure out what those are and use them appropriately. And the reason is just like, as someone who can see the screen and read the content visually, when they arrive on a web page, it's like super duper unlikely that they're going to read every single word on the page. They're probably going to like scan and skim around to find whatever they're specifically looking for. And they often use headings to do that. So similarly, someone who's using assistive technology like a screen reader who arrives on a page doesn't want to have to read all of the words on that page. So what having headings does, and when you tag the headings correctly, that allows the assistive technology to identify where the headings are and kind of pull them out and extract them and create like a menu that the user can scroll through and use to jump to different sections of the page. So that's like really super important for usability for people using assistive technology. And so it's really important to follow the guidelines about headings. And those are that you need to tag all headings on the page. You need to tag only headings on the page. So that means don't use the heading format or style or whatever for text that isn't actually a heading. And you shouldn't skip heading levels, which means that like if you have a section that has a heading that's heading level 2, if you want to have a subsection within that, that section should have heading level 3. You can't skip directly from 2 to 4, for example. So another important one is to have good labels for links. And the reason for this is similar to headings. Assistive technology can kind of extract links from the page and use that to build a navigation menu to help users find specific information on the page. So first requirement is that all links need to be readable, or in other words, pronounceable by assistive technology, which basically means it shouldn't be just like a copy pasted raw URL. Like every link needs to have actual words in English that they can click on to follow it. So second, each link label should be informative. And what that means is that when you look at a link by itself, like without any of the surrounding text or images or anything, you should be able to guess where it goes or what it does. So like, for example, if you see a link all by itself, like what's on this slide that just says click here, that tells you absolutely nothing about what happens when you click that link, where you go, or what you'll be able to do. So that would be considered completely uninformative. Another common uninformative link label that I see is learn more, which is usually just too generic. And another one I see a lot is just website. Like most links on the internet go to a website. So in order to be informative, that needs to be more specific. And then lastly, every link label on a page needs to be unique within that page. So for example, if you have a page that lists a bunch of events and each event has a register button or a register link, if you can see the screen, it might be obvious which link goes with which event. but that might not be the case if you're using assistive technology. So that needs to be conveyed within the link label itself. So lastly, tables. I know there tends to be a lot of interest in accessibility for tables because I tend to get a lot of questions about that, but I'm gonna have to deliver some bad news because from my perspective, I don't think tables can really ever be fully accessible in terms of being both equally available to and effective for people who are using assistive technology. And that's because there's this kind of inherent like philosophical or logical issue that tables are by definition two-dimensional data structures, like they have rows and columns. But when you're using assistive technology like a screen reader, that converts text to sound, and sound is a time-based medium, and time is one dimension, you know, in the reality that we live in or whatever. So like, no matter how careful you are when creating the table, and no matter how, you know, if you correctly tag it and whatnot, you're never going to be able to escape this like inherent problem of having to take two-dimensional information and somehow squash it into one dimension. It's kind of like the issue with world maps, where there's like problems when you try and take a three-dimensional sphere and squash it into two dimensions. It's difficult to make it both usable and still accurate. So that said, I know a lot of people in science and academia really love tables, and it can be hard to move people away from them. So there are some things that you can do to make tables somewhat more usable for people who are using assistive technology. But I do think you need to keep in mind that it's going to be really, really difficult, if not impossible, to get a table to a point where it's truly equally effective for people using assistive technology. So the main thing you need to be aware of in terms of table accessibility is this concept of table headers. People who maybe already know a little bit about web accessibility and like know about the concept of table headers tend to think about them kind of in the context of the whole table. Like, okay, the first row of the table is the header for the whole table. But you really should think of table headers at the level of individual cells, because assistive technology like screen readers can really only look at one cell at a time. So like, imagine you're going through a table cell by cell, and you get to this one that I have displayed on the slide, and your screen reader reads out to you just 7. And that doesn't mean anything. There's no context for that number, so it's just random and you can't do anything with that. So what headers do is they provide context for the information in the cell. So imagine you're using a screen reader going through that table, and when you get to the cell, instead of saying just 7, the screen reader says, years of service, Sarah Smith, 7. At that point, now you actually like know a piece of information, which is that Sarah Smith has 7 years of service. That extra context, the extra text that got read out, came from headers that were associated with the cell, either by being in the same row or the same column as it is. And what's important to note is that in order to have interpreted that piece of information, we needed the context from both a column header and a row header. So like, if we didn't have the row header, we would have just got years of service, 7. And that's like almost a piece of useful information, but without the row header telling us who or what we're talking about, it's incomplete. So like I said, a lot of people tend to think about like the first row of the table is going to have headers in it. Almost always the first column of the table should also have headers in it, because like I said, tables are two-dimensional data structures and the meaning of a cell comes from the intersection of the row and the column. So now that I've gone and listed about 5 million problems that you might find in content, I want to share a few tools and strategies that can help you identify them more specifically and then solve them, hopefully. So first is this really, really useful free online tool called WAVE, or the Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool. This is provided by WebAIM, which is the same organization that developed the color contrast checker that I mentioned earlier. And what this WAVE tool does is it lets you enter a web page URL, and then it scans that page and identifies and highlights accessibility errors and like potential accessibility problems. It also has features that can help you determine the reading order or the source code order of a page, like I mentioned earlier. And it can also help check that all headings are properly tagged. So you can access this at wave.webaim.org. There's also a browser extension called No Coffee Vision Simulator, and this is available for both Google Chrome and Firefox, so you can Google to find it for whichever of those browsers you use. You can use this extension on a page to like simulate what it would look like for people with a variety of like vision related conditions. So for example, on this slide, I have a screenshot of a simulation of what a page looks like for someone who is colorblind. And actually it has a few options for like different types of colorblindness. And it also has options for like reduced peripheral vision or reduced visual contrast or visual noise and things like that. So you can use this to like test content, particularly like graphical content, to make sure that it's effective for people with these conditions. And then one thing that I would really highly recommend is for everyone to, at some point, at least try using a screen reader themselves. I think a lot of people are like intimidated by this idea, but like I said earlier, screen readers are just software that's installed on a computer. You don't need any special kind of equipment to use one. And something to know is that like while the screen reader is active, while it's turned on, the screen is still visible, like it is still on, the mouse still works. So you don't need to worry about like, oh, if I turn on the screen reader, I'll get totally lost and won't be able to turn it back off. You can still use the mouse and everything like normal if you want to. So there are a couple of free screen reader options. For Windows, you can download and install one called NVDA. And for Mac, which is what I use, there's actually a screen reader built into the operating system called VoiceOver. So you just need to open System Preferences, go into Accessibility and turn it on. And there's even like a little tutorial available to teach you how to do it. So I would recommend checking one of those out for sure. So now I just want to talk a little bit about some potential strategies for making accessibility a regular part of your workflow. One that I have used is creating like a personalized checklist that's based on WCAG requirements that are relevant to the specific type of content that I'm working on. So like there are different requirements you need to pay attention to when you're writing text versus designing graphics versus editing videos and so on. Because like I said, WCAG is pretty long and can be pretty highly technical. So if you can narrow it down to just what is directly relevant to what you're doing, that will be a lot more manageable. Another really helpful thing can be to build content out of blocks or templates that are reused and that have been tested and confirmed to be accessible. So like using a content management system like Drupal or WordPress can be really good for that. Or otherwise you might maintain your own library somewhere of design templates or blocks or components or whatever. And then lastly, if possible, you could add a step in whatever publication process you already have to include an accessibility review. So like maybe you have a process where before it gets published, a page gets sent to subject matter experts to review. And you could add a step that when you get it back, then you put it into the Wave tool to identify potential accessibility issues. So this next section is for those of us who like work with subject matter experts or like support other people who create content. And it's about getting buy-in around accessibility, or in other words, motivating people to create accessible content. So when I think about motivation, I think of that metaphor or idiom or whatever it is about how you can motivate a donkey to do what you want it to by using either a carrot or a stick. And the idea is like a carrot is the positive reward that it gets for doing what you want. Like, you know, if you do what I want, something good will happen. So if we think about that in the context of creating accessible content, there are a couple kind of like carrots we might be able to offer people. So for example, you might highlight or promote content that meets accessibility requirements, or even give an award or some other type of public recognition to authors or people who regularly produce accessible content. So then traditionally, in that metaphor with the donkey, the opposite of a carrot is usually a stick, with the idea like, if you don't do what I want you to, I'm gonna hit you with the stick. And like, you know, maybe I'm a softie, but I don't really like that one. Like, especially when you're working with people, like I want to have a positive relationship with the people I work with. So I'm like not interested at all in like punishing people for doing the wrong thing. So instead, I've kind of made up this alternative that I call a halter, where the idea is like, I'm not going to give you the opportunity to not do what I want. Or maybe in other words, I'm going to force you to do what I want, whether you like it or not. And so obviously that requires more effort on your part. Like in the metaphor with the donkey, you might end up dragging that donkey all the way to wherever it is you want to go, but like, at least it's gonna get there. So some examples of this. One thing that I do is that every week I have a report that I look at that lists all the content that was added to our website that week. And I go through each item and fix whatever accessibility errors I find. And I keep track of those fixes that I make. So in our case, we use Drupal. So I just use the revision log message functionality. And then later, I can go back and look at that information to try and identify like patterns of where accessibility issues tend to pop up. And then I can figure out what specific training or outreach would be most effective in improving compliance. Another thing we're starting to do, because we run into so many issues with PDFs and accessibility, is we're working on updating our website to slowly over time restrict people's ability to upload PDFs at all. And what we're doing instead is we're coming up with a system where the website can generate PDFs from web pages. So we'll end up where like if somebody really wants to have a PDF, in order to have that, they're going to have to create a web page. which is a better format for accessibility. And then one other idea, which I've thought about a lot, but we haven't implemented, is that you could require accessibility training before even allowing people to do things on a website, like publish content or upload PDFs. All right, so the last thing I want to say is that no matter how careful you are or how much you pay attention to accessibility, you're probably going to miss something at some point. So I think it's really important to have a process in place that people can use to request alternate versions of any piece of content that isn't accessible to them. And then to inform users about that process by including a statement or something, which itself needs to be accessible to assistive technology, obviously. So, for example, this is the language that OSU has provided for us to use. This publication or posting or information or whatever will be made available in an accessible alternate format upon request. Please contact email address or phone number. And that's the end of my slides. Thank you for listening. I'll look in chat to see if there's anything.
Thank you,
Looks like just
Amory.
links.
Thank you. I think I just put a bunch of links in there. I couldn't find the No Coffee link, but I did come across a link to a whole list of accessibility tools. So I included that in there. I'm not sure what, I just couldn't find the appropriate link. So I just put that in there. Does anybody have any questions for Amory today? Please unmute or put your question in the chat. We have a few minutes remaining. You timed your presentation perfectly.
And to anybody who may be watching a recording of this in the future, feel free to contact me to talk about accessibility. My email address is on the slide now.
So Bethany has a question or comment in the chat. She says, a problem I sometimes have when I'm trying to mitigate issues on tables is not knowing where to assign the T head and body when there are header rows and columns. Any advice for that?
Mm-hmm. So actually the T head and T body tags that you're talking about have zero effect on the accessibility of the table. Screen readers and stuff don't even really look at those. So they're mostly used for like styling purposes. So if you want like the first few rows of your table to be a different color or something, that's what that's mostly for.
Oh, that's good to know. Very good to know. I do have a question. One of the things that we had been putting PDFs of our publications online, and we recently went ahead and, it's a long story, but we went ahead and started creating our HTML pages. And, you know, a lot of our publications have tables. I've noticed some of our colleagues in other states have not been putting the tables in the HTML. They've been putting links to open another file with a table. Is that something that's a good alternative? You still have to make that table and that alternate file accessible, but is it better to remove it from the HTML on the website or just provide that as an alternative way to view it?
That's a tough question. In my experience, HTML is the best way to have the most accessible table. Because in HTML, it has all of those like attributes like for headers and the scope and things like that. In PDFs and other platforms, I have found that when they say a table is accessible, it's really not that accessible. It's not as good as it could be in HTML. So there is no ideal solution. The ideal solution is to not have a table. Like if a lot of times a table is like for looking up something. And so something, if you have the ability to make it like a little interactive calculator, like put in the acreage of your farm or whatever, and then it will tell you how much fertilizer for that acreage.
I know that we're doing the HTML page, but we still provide the downloadable
Mhm.
PDFs. So, and we have done our best to our
Mhm.
ability to make those PDFs accessible, but tables are always there's always something that catches, and no matter how hard we try, it never comes out perfect. So we're doing the best that we can to get those PDFs accessible as well. And I love your metaphor with the halters and the sticks, because that's something that one thing that I will share that we've done, it's not for a website, but we have created a Word template that we provide our authors so they can create what we're calling our non-peer reviewed content. So we've made it a template where we've provided them instructions on how to apply styles. And if you follow this template, it should be close to being accessible. And then when they submit it to us, we review it. Like you said, we go through and do a check. And if it's totally out of whack, we usually send it back to them and use it as a learning moment and say, oh, you didn't apply your alt text, or you need to make sure you apply your styles. If there's little tweaks, we just go ahead and tweak it, and then we post it. And that has worked. We've done that for a few years now, and that's really saved us some time. But you know, and as I'm sure most of you know, a lot of these rules keep changing, and the technology keeps changing, and the software changes. So we're constantly trying to figure out how to, you know, manipulate our content within those parameters. So are there any other questions? Anybody at all? This has been really, really good. I wrote some notes down, and I will definitely send Heather some info to send out to the membership. I do want to say I did put a link into the chat for our survey, or evaluation, I guess. And I just take a couple minutes to fill that out and provide us your input and tell us what other topics that you would like to hear about. We do have, I've got to find it here. We do have another accessibility webinar already scheduled for Tuesday, August 1st at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And that is on accessibility regarding InDesign to PDF files. And that's probably going to be a big one, because a lot of us have to deal with that. So mark your calendars, and we will make sure we get that one promoted well in advance, but we hope you will join us for that as well. So with that, if there's not any more questions, I hope you all have a great day, and we'll see you again on a future webinar.
Thanks again, everybody.